Okay, so when I say Blue Beetle to you, do you think of the recent guy with the Guyver armor that looks like he can shoot lasers out of every single part of his body? Or do you think of a different person? Somebody from the 90s or somebody from the 60s? You'd all be right. There have been 3 different Blue Beetles because he's a legacy character. Legacy characters in comic books are not common, but they're not necessarily all that rare. It depends on what kind of legacy character we're talking about. In the case of DC and Marvel, there are sort of 2 camps. The first is sort of the, broadly speaking, character sort of society legacy. Your Robins, your Supermans, your Batmans. There's lots of different versions of those characters. And sometimes they give up the name, and then oftentimes they take it back, usually for some kind of shakeup in the editorial department. In the case of Blue Beetle, or in Marvel's side, Captain Marvel and other characters like them, they're more of like an inheritor character. When Superman died and passed on the mantle to somebody else, or when Batman died and did the same thing, those characters never kept those powers and never kept that status quo for very long. A year, 2 years, whatever it was, they would eventually revert the change. In the case of Blue Beetle and Captain Marvel respectively, the change was never undone. When Dan Garrett died, Ted Kord became Blue Beetle. When Ted Kord died, Jaime Reyes became Blue Beetle. And to this point, they haven't undone those changes. Dan is still dead and Ted is still retired. He came back to life, but he's retired now. In the case of Captain Marvel, Mar-Vell of the Kree Empire died of cancer. They never reverted that decision, and now Carol Danvers, after several other characters in between who had very short periods of Captain Marvel, is now the new Captain Marvel since 2012. So that's a whole gobbledygook of stuff. Here's why it's important though. Legacy characters bring us into the fold more than I think any other type of character in comics. You can like a Captain America and you can like a Cyborg or a Nightwing, but those characters exist primarily on their own, and they don't really change that much. When you read a legacy character, you're reading a mantle. You're reading an entire labor, a whole ecosystem of characters. When you read Batman, you're reading not just Batman, but all the Robins, all the other Batmen, all the other characters that have taken the Bat title, including Batgirl and Batwoman and everybody else that deserves that title and mantle. So there's an entire legacy of characters. But when you read Blue Beetle or Captain Marvel, you're reading an anthology almost, like an episode by episode history in the unmaking. Going back to Dan Garrett is like doing archaeology. Going to Ted Kord is like watching old TV shows. And watching Jaime is like watching what's hip right now. Captain Marvel's much the same way. You want to go back and read Captain Marvel, Mar-Vell, or even Monica Rambeau or any other characters that had that name, that's fine, but you're going back to vintage comics. None of them kept that name, and some of them are even dead and have stayed dead. So why is this important? Well, in comics, just like in TV, there's a certain type of storytelling that is generally considered to be the most common. That is the saga, something that takes place over a long period of time where characters change up to a point. If you watch a soap opera, for example, Passions, General Hospital, whatever canceled soap opera your poison is, those characters have been in that soap opera for decades, in some cases. Same character, oftentimes the same actor, and they rarely change dramatically. They've had all kinds of stories, deaths, resurrections, betrayals, all kinds of things. But at the end of the day, if you came onto that soap opera in the 1990s or the 2010s, you'll probably pick up what's going on and won't be left behind. That's okay. That's actually pretty good, all things being equal. But it doesn't mean that you get a lot of change. You don't get a lot of something to grip onto or look back on and reference and have a deep narrative. What you get is something that you constantly shift and retcon and do away with and ignore and forget about. Makes the character easy, but it makes the character static. A legacy character, specifically the inheritor types that I've been talking about, change dramatically. They can die and stay dead. They can be hurt and stay crippled. They can have all kinds of events happen to them, and because of the writers or editors or the way they approach the character, they never change. Dan is still dead. Mar-Vell is still dead. Cancer, bullet wounds, terrible villains, deaths in the family, they stick. And that means that this character feels lived in. This world feels earned. When they do good things, it's because of the bad things that happen to them. When Batman does something good, we realize cerebrally that it's because his parents were murdered, but that happened in real life 70 years ago. None of us who watch this episode are going to remember what those comic books were like unless we went back to the past through archives and read them. And even then, it wasn't new to us. It's new because we read it, but not new because it came out around now. So the stories feel deeper somehow. They feel like miniseries, or they feel like seasons of a television show almost. And that comes with stakes, and stakes are good. Stakes means you have something to say and something to lose. Why do we change characters? Why do we allow them to go from one place to the next and make the change permanent? Because you get new characters, and the change is earned, not random. A great example. In The Killing Joke, Barbara Gordon was shot in the spine and paralyzed. An end to a career of decades of Batgirl. But rather than just being relegated to side character status and hanging out in the shadows or being sad about being paralyzed, she became Oracle, a arguably better version of the character, one that fit into a niche that the Bat family didn't have. Later, they reverted those changes, but that wasn't true to the character. Barbara Gordon, for many, many, many years now, has been Oracle. Arguably, her better interpretation. We have Oracle in comics still because of that. We have Blue Beetles because they allowed these things to change. We have Robins because they allowed them to change. They did things with Robin they wouldn't do with any other character. A very interesting thing with legacy characters also is that oftentimes they can diverge from the primary path, the main character they're taking their mantle from, and sometimes they don't. Here's an example of that. Blue Beetle, the first Blue Beetle, Dan Garrett, gained his powers from the Scarab. The Scarab allowed Dan to fly, have X-ray vision, shoot energy beams, super strength, that kind of thing. He only pulled part of the powers out of the Beetle and was a superhero in the 40s and 50s and 60s. Ted, the next Blue Beetle, inherited the mantle and the Scarab. He, however, wasn't able to use the Scarab, so he had to use his mind. And emulating Batman and emulating the characters of the era, Blue Beetle was a no-nonsense, cerebral superhero, but he wouldn't kill. He used the BB gun, which is sort of a flashbang with a handle, to knock villains out and distract things and allow him to fight in close combat. When Jaime became the Blue Beetle years later, Jaime became a hybrid of the two. He had the Scarab that Dan used, although he pulled more powers out of it, the full carapace. But he also wouldn't kill, like Ted. He would convert his arm weapons into flashbangs with handles, air guns, and things of that nature. He emulated Ted and Dan through a level of mentorship or hero worship or just inheritance. He wanted to be the best Blue Beetle, and that meant he came from a legacy of characters. Captain Marvel, same thing. Captain Marvel wielded the Negabands and was a Kree hybrid, a Kree mutate with superhuman abilities, or super Kree abilities. Carol was just human. And when the explosion, the Psychomagnetron, gave her her original abilities, they were powers inherited from Captain Marvel. After that, she became binary, and several other types of superhuman abilities sort of came to her over the years as she existed in comics for 60 of them. But her hero worship of the original Captain Marvel, her wanting to take on the mantle, to be the character that he was, meant that she was a leader. She fought the same way that he did, because the mantle is the character. Batman is Batman, but we know Batman is Bruce Wayne. Blue Beetle is Dan, Ted, and Jaime. Captain Marvel is Marvel, Monica, and several others, and Carol. The legacy is the character. Legacy is important in comics. Inheriting that legacy, even more so. So why is it important? Because change is scary. But scary doesn't have to be bad. Change is also good if we embrace it. Well, thank you for watching, and if you like this episode, tell us what your favorite legacy character is in the comments below, and we'll see you next time.